before the world was filled with digits, formulas, and ledgers. There was something else, a silence, a space that had not yet been named. Numbers had not always existed. Once the human mind saw the world as a swirl of things, stars, stones, animals, crops. One could point at them, touch them, count them with fingers or marks in the dirt. But the idea of a number, a symbol that could stand in for an abstract amount, that was a different matter entirely. And the idea that there could be a symbol for nothing, that was almost unthinkable. In the earliest human settlements, tallies appeared like scars across bones and wood, marks made to count the days of the moon, the catch of the hunt, the baskets of grain. These were not numbers in the modern sense. They were memories etched into the world, reminders of what had happened, never of what was absent. The concept of zero, the empty column, the missing place, had no home in these early systems. Why would it? In a world where survival hinged on presence, what use was absence? As civilizations grew, so did the sophistication of their record-keeping. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed wedges into clay tablets, giving rise to cuneiform numerals. The Babylonians, brilliant and methodical, even devised a place value system, but with a twist. They left gaps to signify the absence of a value, a kind of proto-zero. But it wasn't a number, it was a pause, an omission, and even that absence was unstable. In some tablets it appears, in others it doesn't. Zero had not yet claimed its throne. The Egyptians, too, were adept at numbers, building pyramids with precision and tracking the stars. Yet their system, like Rome's centuries later, was additive. Tally marks bundled into hieroglyphs. No placeholders, no negatives, no zero. Their cosmos was full of gods, cycles, and rebirths. Nothingness had no place in their eternal calendar. Even in Greece, where logic reigned and abstract thought flourished, zero remained a shadow. Aristotle dismissed the void. Nothingness, he said, could not exist, for even to speak of it was to give it presence. The Greeks gave us geometry, prime numbers, and rigorous proofs, but zero, the quietest of all numbers, eluded them. To acknowledge it was to acknowledge a paradox. How could something represent nothing and still be something? In marketplaces and temples, scribes and priests tallied debts and offerings. Merchants made deals. Kings levied taxes, all without zero. They calculated by presence, by what was there. If a sack was empty, it was not counted. If a debt was settled, it disappeared. The notion of tracking the void, of naming it, remained foreign. In a spiritual world full of divine order, there was little appetite for a number that whispered of chaos. And yet, in the East, something different was stirring. In the Indian subcontinent, thinkers began to entertain the possibility that the void was not terrifying but foundational. Philosophers and mathematicians in ancient India grappled with the concept of shunya, emptiness, not as an absence, but as a fertile ground. In this cosmology, nothingness was not the enemy of being, it was the condition for it. Here, the zero would find its first breath, but that was still to come. In the West, the idea of zero lingered as a ghost. No inscriptions bore its mark, no equations balanced with its help. The void remained unnumbered, unspoken, and yet it waited. Because even in cultures that denied it, the need for zero was creeping in. Trade demanded efficiency. Astronomy demanded precision. And as humanity looked up at the stars and began to map their rhythms, the empty spaces between them demanded recognition. This was the world before zero, full of life, motion, and meaning, but terrified of absence. It was a world of presence only, where the ledger stopped at 1. Yet hidden in its heart was a hunger for something more precise, more honest, a way to name the silence, to write the gap, to measure the unmeasurable. 0 had not yet arrived, but its shadow was already stretching across the sands of time. The absence of 0 did not mean the absence of mathematical thought, but it did mean limitations. The abacus, used widely across ancient China and elsewhere, required tactile presence beads, stones, notches. You could count large sums, even perform square roots, but without a way to denote an empty place. Each number floated free. It was context, not symbolism, that provided clarity. This dependence on context meant that errors were common. A misplaced symbol or unclear spacing could collapse an entire ledger. It also meant that memory played a central role. People held numbers in their minds more than on the page. Calculation was performance. Commerce was memory. The mind, not the manuscript, bore the weight of truth. And yet, even these societies were inching toward something. In the Americas, the Mayans developed a sophisticated numeral system, including a shell-shaped glyph that represented 0. It was used in their calendars, crucial to tracking cosmic cycles. To the Mayans, time was circular, divine, and 0 was its pivot point. Here, in the jungles of Central America, a culture found the courage to name the void. But that knowledge remained isolated. The Mayans fell, their systems faded, and 0 remained a fragmented dream, an answer glimpsed, but not embraced. The challenge was not just mathematical. It was cultural, religious, psychological. To accept 0 was to accept the void. To accept the void was to accept the possibility of absence. And for many, that was unbearable. It is hard to overstate just how alien 0 was to the Western world. In Rome, numbers were carved into stone, literal and eternal. The idea of a digit that marked nothingness, a hole in the numerical fabric, would have seemed blasphemous. What could possibly be gained by quantifying a lack? What use was there for the count of nothing? And yet, it would come. It would come not through conquest or decree, but through need. Need for a better way to count, to reckon, to predict. Need, as always, would be the mother of revolution. And the first true 0, the one that would travel west and change everything, was already stirring in India, born, not from fear, but from insight. 0 would not remain an outsider forever. It would find a voice, it would find disciples, and it would find enemies, powerful ones. But before it shook the world, it had to be born. And for that to happen, someone had to look into the void and see not darkness, but possibility. Long before Europe dared whisper the concept of the void, a quiet revolution had begun thousands of miles to the east, in the fertile intellectual soils of ancient India, where philosophy, ritual, and observation were deeply entwined. A new symbol emerged, not of presence, but of absence. It was a small circle, humble and quiet, and yet that circle would change the world. India's earliest numeral systems, like the Brahmi script, were already more advanced than the clumsy tallies of the West. By the 3rd century BCE, Indian mathematicians were working with abstract numbers far beyond what their Greek or Roman contemporaries dared. But even these early thinkers did not yet name the void. That would come later, driven by spiritual philosophy as much as by mathematics. At the heart of this breakthrough was a concept already central to Indian cosmology: shunyata, or emptiness. Unlike in the West, where nothingness was often feared or seen as heretical, in Indian thought it was a foundation. Emptiness was not destruction, but potential. It was the womb of creation, the breath before a word, the stillness before form. In Buddhist and Hindu philosophies, the void was sacred. Into this world of spiritual paradoxes stepped Brahmagupta, a 7th century mathematician and astronomer from the city of Ujjain, a major center of learning. In 628 CE, he wrote the Brahma-Sphutistetten, a groundbreaking text that for the first time treated zero as both a placeholder and a number with its own properties. He called it shunya, echoing the spiritual emptiness that underpinned Indian cosmology. Brahmagupta's zero was radical. He laid down rules that we take for granted today. 0 plus a number is the number. A number minus itself is 0. 0 times anything is 0. But his rules weren't perfect. Division by 0 still confounded him as it would the world for centuries. Yet the leap he made was enough to tip the world on its axis. For the first time, nothing had a name, a symbol, a logic. This was not just a mathematical advance. It was a philosophical one. In embracing zero, Indian mathematicians were articulating a worldview where absence had as much weight as presence. The circle that represented 0 often, just a dot or hollow mark, stood for the fullness of emptiness, the symmetry of the infinite. It was not a blank, it was a statement. The use of 0 flourished in Indian astronomy, which required precise calculations to track planetary motion, eclipses, and celestial rhythms. Without 0, their equations would have crumbled. But with it, Indian scholars charted the skies with startling accuracy. In doing so, they laid the foundation for trigonometry, algebra, and eventually calculus. 0 was also essential in commerce. As Indian trade routes expanded across Asia and the Middle East, the merchants carried not just spices and textiles, but symbols. The decimal system, powered by 0, allowed for concise, powerful record-keeping. Complex calculations became simpler, columns aligned. The ledger learned to speak a new language. And so 0 began its slow migration. From India, it would pass through the Islamic Golden Age, translated and refined by Arabic scholars. But in its birthplace, it had already done something miraculous. It had turned absence into a tool. It had named the void. It had made the invisible visible. The circle was drawn. The silence was given sound. In the East, 0 was no longer feared. It was embraced as a number, a concept, and a symbol of the mysterious balance between being and non-being. And from this balance, a new mathematics would be born, one that would echo across continents and centuries. In the 9th century, beneath the golden dome of Baghdad's rising empire, a quiet fire was lit in the streets, but in the pages of books, in the ink of scrolls, in the minds of scholars. This was not just a time of conquest. It was a time of translation. Ideas old and new flooded into the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate from every corner of the known world. Among these ideas was a small, mysterious symbol circle. It came from India. It meant nothing, and yet it would soon mean everything. The Caliphate, especially under the rule of Caliph Ulman, had declared knowledge sacred. In Baghdad, he founded the Beit al-Hikmath, the House of Wisdom, a place where scholars from across religions and lands were summoned to translate, preserve, and expand the world's knowledge. From Sanskrit to Arabic, Greek to Syriac, texts were reborn. Among the most transformative of these were Indian mathematical treatises that carried with them the concept of shunya zero. It was here that Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi entered history. A Persian polymath, he would become one of the most influential figures in mathematics, not by inventing zero, but by showing the world how to use it. Al-Khwarizmi studied the Indian numeral system and saw its power. In his works, especially Kitab al-Jam-wal-Tafriq by Hisab al-Hind, he introduced Hindu numerals including zero to the Arabic-speaking world. But Al-Khwarizmi did more than just transmit knowledge. He reshaped it. His approach to equations, variables, and balance gave birth to algebra jabr in Arabic. Algebra was not geometry's younger sibling, but a new form of thought, more abstract and flexible. And zero was its quiet engine. Without a placeholder, equations collapsed. With it, they soared. Arabic numerals, what the West would one day call Hindu Arabic, were revolutionary. No more clunky Roman numerals or unwieldy Greek letters. Now, 10 simple digits, arranged with positional value and powered by zero, could express any number. Traders embraced them. Astronomers depended on them. Engineers trusted them. For centuries, they would remain the most powerful tools in any scholar's hands. Zero in the Islamic world was not feared, it was welcomed. Theologically, Islamic thought did not stumble over the idea of nothingness in the same way Western Christian doctrine would. In fact, the concept of void appeared in Islamic cosmology and mysticism. The idea of non-being was compatible with a divine, unknowable unity. The symbolic circle of zero felt almost sacred, less perfect, humble. With zero, the Islamic Golden Age produced feats of calculation and observation that stunned the world. Astronomers like al-Battani and al-Tusi refined planetary models. Engineers designed intricate automata. Calendars grew more precise. Navigation improved. The decimal system allowed for complex arithmetic with speed and clarity. Entire libraries of mathematics were built upon that single, empty circle. And so, the legacy of India's zero deepened in Arabic lands. Baghdad became the beating heart of a new mathematics. From there, the numbers traveled westward through trade and conquest, into North Africa, Al-Andalus, and eventually Europe. But for now, in the courts and libraries of the Caliphate, zero was not controversial. It was elegant, useful, powerful. Ironically, the word zero itself would come not from Arabic, but from its Latinized echo. Cifra became zephyrum in Italian, which became zero. But the symbol's solid's logic, its silence remained, rooted in both Indian philosophy and Islamic mathematics. This was the age when knowledge knew no borders. Christian monks debated with Muslim scholars. Jewish scribes copied Arabic treatises. Ideas leaped across languages and empires. In this mosaic of intellect, zero flourished not as a threat, but as a gift. A small circle passed from palm to palm, and with it, the world quietly began to change. In the shadowed scriptoriums of medieval Europe, monks hunched over vellum scrolls, illuminating texts with gold leaf and crimson ink. Their world was orderly, hierarchical, and rooted in the sacred. And in their arithmetic, there was no place for a zero. Numbers, like saints, had identities. They were whole, countable, and meaningful only in presence. The idea of nothing as a quantity, it had no place in this worldview. For centuries, Europe clung to a mathematics of presence rigid, cumbersome, and deeply symbolic. The mathematics of the Roman Empire had survived not because it was efficient, but because it was familiar. Roman numerals, derived from tally marks and symbols, were additive. X meant 10, L 50, M 1,000. To write a large number was to pile symbols upon symbols. There was no positional value, no placeholders. Every figure stood alone. Arithmetic with Roman numerals was not calculation, it was translation, a labor of memory and repetition. Traders and clerks used counting boards, simple wooden slates with columns of pebbles or beads. This abacus-like device allowed for basic arithmetic, but only in a physical, tactile form. The mind had to supply what the numerals could not. There was no room for theoretical manipulation. Without zero, the entire system lacked flexibility, and so math remained an art of surfaces. The Church, which held Europe's intellectual monopoly, did not look kindly on abstraction. Numbers were sacred: 3 for the Trinity, 7 for divine completeness, 12 for apostles. Mathematical inquiry beyond these symbols was viewed with suspicion. The void, in particular, was theologically unsettling. To assign value to nothingness was to flirt with the edge of heresy. After all, how could God create a world with nothing in it? As a result, mathematical progress stalled. Geometry survived through Euclid, preserved in Latin translations. But algebra, positional notation, and the idea of zero were foreign, exotic, even dangerous. In an age where books were chained to walls and copying a text took a year, new ideas moved at a crawl. This had consequences. Trade across Europe was clumsy, dependent on local systems and coin weights. Interest calculations were opaque. Engineering feats, cathedrals, aqueducts, bridges were executed through craft, not computation. The mind of a stonemason was more useful than that of a scholar. Mathematics had little role in daily life beyond measuring grain or tallying tithes. Yet even within this arid landscape, a quiet yearning persisted. Pilgrims returned from the East with strange tales. Crusaders brought home books in unfamiliar scripts. Merchants in Venice, Genoa, and Marseille traded with Arab lands where numbers moved like water fluid, elegant, precise, and some began to wonder, what if there was a better way to count? In the universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, the first cracks began to show. Translators working from Arabic texts introduced ideas from Al-Khwarizmi and others. Slowly, painfully, these ideas entered the bloodstream of European thought, but resistance was fierce. Arabic numerals were called infidel numbers. Zero was dismissed as sorcery. In 1299, the city of Florence even banned the use of Arabic numerals in official records. Still, ideas have a way of surviving. In secret ledgers and merchant notebooks, the new numerals began to spread. They were faster, cleaner, and more practical. And at their core was the zero, a silent revolution, a cipher that opened doors no Roman numeral ever could. Europe's ancient math had once shunned the void, but as the Renaissance dawned and the thirst for knowledge returned, the continent would rediscover what it had feared. Zero was no longer a threat. It was the key. The idea came quietly. It slipped across the sea in the margins of trade ledgers, whispered between merchants, tucked into the sacks of traveling scholars. It had no sword, no army, no kingdom, just a symbol, a small, empty circle. Yet when zero arrived in Western Europe, it sparked a storm. By the turn of the 13th century, Europe was stirring. Crusades had opened eyes to the wider world. Trade was flourishing. Markets in Venice, Genoa, and Marseille were teeming with goods from North Africa and the Levant. And along with silk and spices came something stranger: books. These books were not written in Latin. They carried the curled, elegant script of Arabic. And in them, European scholars found something shocking: a new way to count. 10 digits, not 26. Numbers arranged with place value. Equations that balanced elegantly, even when one of the numbers was nothing at all. Enter Leonardo of Pisa, better known as Fibonacci, born around 1170, the son of a merchant working in North Africa. Fibonacci was educated in the Muslim world. There, he learned the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, the same system that had matured in India and spread through Islamic lands. When he returned to Italy, he brought with him a gift wrapped in logic, Liber Abaci, his 1202 book that laid out the advantages of this new mathematics. It was revolutionary. Fibonacci showed how these numerals could simplify trade, calculate interest, and make conversions with ease. He explained zero not as a curiosity, but as a toolus, essential, powerful, necessary. Yet to many in Europe, it felt like heresy. Why? Because zero was not just a number, it was an idea. It meant nothingness, absence, void. And in a society steeped in Christian theology, nothingness was not a concept to be celebrated. It was associated with hell, with chaos, with the absence of God. To say that nothing could be something that it could be counted was unsettling. Governments, too, grew suspicious. In 1299, the city of Florence issued a decree. Arabic numerals were banned from official documents. The reason? They were too easy to alter. A 0 could be turned into a 6 with a stroke of the pen. Fraud could flourish. Roman numerals, for all their clumsiness, were secure, immutable, honest. But beneath the ban, the idea kept spreading. Merchants adopted the new numerals in private. Bankers and moneylenders found them indispensable. In underground ledgers and whispered lessons, 0 took root. It was practical magic, hiding in plain sight. The church, too, wavered. Some scholars condemned the new math. Others saw its utility. Theologians debated whether the void had a place in a divine universe. Could God, who created everything, also create nothing? The very question bent minds and tested faith. And yet, the world was changing. Trade was growing. Navigation was evolving. The stars demanded measurement. The old systems groaned under the weight of precision. And the new system 0, and all was simply better. Slowly, inevitably, resistance gave way to adoption. By the dawn of the Renaissance, 0 had infiltrated the West, not with fanfare, but with persistence. The dangerous idea had won, and the world would never count the same way again. The edict, they say, came cloaked in solemn authority. Somewhere within the papal corridors of power, a decree went out. This strange number, this cipher of emptiness, would be forbidden. It was not just a mathematical decision. It was a defense of theology, a stand against the void. The story is murky part myth, part record. There is no single moment where a pope stood and formally outlawed 0. And yet, the legend persists that the church feared the number's implications, that it struck at the heart of divine order. In truth, what unfolded was more complex, slow, tangled resistance waged by bishops, councils, and clerics against a creeping tide of abstraction. To understand why, one must understand the medieval mind. In Christian Europe, the universe was full. God was fullness incarnate, the creator of all things. The void, the absence, was not neutral, it was evil. Hell was described as a place of emptiness, separation from God's light. The very idea that nothing could have value was deeply unsettling. And so, when the numeral 0 arrived, bearing with it the echoes of Eastern philosophies and Islamic logic, it carried more than mathematics. It carried danger. Clerics saw trouble not just in 0 itself, but in the world it enabled: place, value, negative numbers, equations that solved with absence of it, smelled of sorcery. What would it mean to divide by nothing? What universe allowed for infinity to emerge from a cipher? These were not just questions of numbers, they were heresies cloaked in numerals. In this climate, suspicion became policy. Local church councils issued bans. Some bishops declared the use of Arabic numerals in official records sinful. The University of Paris, in its early statutes, discouraged mathematical speculation that did not serve theology. In 1299, Florence, though not acting on papal orders, banned 0 from use in trade, citing fears of fraud and forgery. But behind these public concerns lay deeper unease. 0 was a mirror held to the face of dogma, and what it reflected was uncomfortable. Within the monasteries, where scholars copied and preserved knowledge, a quiet war broke out. Some monks refused to transcribe texts containing the strange numeral. Others annotated their margins with warnings. Yet, younger scholars, exposed to Arabic works translated in Spain and Sicily, began to see 0 not as a threat, but a key, a way forward. Still, they had to tread carefully. Not all church figures were hostile. Some, like the English bishop and scholar Robert Grosseteste, saw mathematics as a divine language capable of revealing God's order. He and others in the emerging scholastic tradition attempted to reconcile logic with faith, but even they struggled with the philosophical implications of 0. How could God create nothing? Was the void part of creation, or a realm outside it? Theologians debated. Could the concept of the infinite, enabled by 0, coexist with divine infinity? If a man could count endlessly, did that infringe upon God's singular eternity? The Church, already wrestling with the implications of the Copernican cosmos and the rediscovery of Aristotle, found in 0 yet another riddle to solve or suppress. And so, the prohibition was never a single ban. It was a thicket of resistance, cultural, theological, intellectual. 0 was not outlawed by papal thunderclap. It was resisted by inertia, by suspicion, by fear of what the void might unmake. Yet, like water in stone, the idea wore down its opposition. Merchants found it indispensable. Mathematicians proved its value. Eventually, even the Church began to accept it not as a spiritual truth, but as a tool of worldly function. 0 slipped through the cracks of dogma and took root in the cracks of accounting books and cathedral blueprints. The Pope may never have banned 0 with a bull or decree, but the spirit of that prohibition fear, of the unknown, the ungraspable, the infinite haunted Europe for centuries, and 0, silent and circular, endured it all. They were not rebels with banners, nor priests in pulpits. They carried no swords, wore no crowns, yet they challenged dogma with ink, paper, and the quiet defiance of numbers. In the late medieval and early Renaissance centuries, a handful of thinkers scattered across Europe began to take 0 seriously. They did not just use it, they explored it, tested it, dared to trust its strange logic. Among them was Nicolas Foucault, a French mathematician born in the mid-15th century, working in the twilight of medieval scholasticism. Foucault wrote Triparti nla, Science de Nombres, a manuscript that remained unpublished in his lifetime, but was radical in content. In it, he embraced place value, exponents, and large numbers freely, using zero as a component of calculation. His notation anticipated modern algebra, though it was met with silence, not celebration. In Italy, Girolamo Cardano walked a sharper edge. A physician, gambler, and polymath, Cardano's 1545 book, Ars Magna Becum, a landmark in the history of algebra. He dealt with negative numbers, then called fictitious, and complex numbers that involved the square roots of negatives. While not centered on zero, his work pushed mathematics into realms where zero was indispensable. He was one of the first Europeans to treat it not as a convenience, but as a conceptual pivot. Cardano's life was as complicated as his equations. He was imprisoned, accused of heresy, and scorned by many. Yet he opened doors that others would walk through. In daring to work with what others feared voids, imaginaries, impossibilities, he gave zero its full landscape. Meanwhile, in Germany, Adam Ries wrote accessible arithmetic books that popularized Hindu-Arabic numerals for merchants and students. His motto, "Make it right with Adam Ries," became a proverb. Though Ries was no theorist, his practical embrace of zero and positional notation helped normalize the idea among tradespeople. Zero slipped from the margins of mysticism into the center of daily commerce. The slow acceptance of zero was aided by the printing press. With the rise of printed mathematical texts, the standardized use of the cipher spread across Europe. Books once copied by hand could now be reproduced and distributed widely. And in their pages, zero began to appear without apology. But resistance still lingered. Even in the 16th century, some universities discouraged the teaching of the new mathematics. Scholars who used Arabic numerals were accused of fraud or occultism. Yet the results could not be denied. With zero, calculations were faster, equations balanced, patterns emerged. The old methods cracked under pressure. Younger minds, unburdened by the old fears, took notice. In classrooms and workshops, zero became a silent partner in invention. It helped engineers plan cities, architects design domes, and astronomers chart the stars. The circle of nothing began to feel like a foundation. These mathematicians, Sheikha, Cardano, Ries, and others, did not march under a banner, but they formed a hidden vanguard. In their manuscripts and marginal notes, they carved out space for absence. They gave form to formlessness. They dared to believe that something could come from nothing, and proved it. Zero was no longer a ghost. In their hands, it became a tool, a truth, and the quiet symbol of a coming age of reason. The revolution did not begin with a bang. It began in ledgers, quietly, carefully, on parchment and vellum. Something new was being written. Merchants, bankers, and scribes, those once relegated to the margins of learned society, were reshaping the world with nothing more than numbers. And at the heart of it all was zero. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, as Europe emerged from medieval slumber, cities like Venice, Florence, Bruges, and Lubeck hummed with commerce. Trading ships crisscrossed the seas. Goods moved by the ton. Silver flowed. And the old Roman system of reckoning, with its rigid letters and cumbersome calculations, could no longer keep pace. Traders needed speed, precision, flexibility. They needed a number system, built not for cathedral walls, but for markets. They found it in the Hindu-Arabic numerals and in zero. It began in Italy in 1494. A Franciscan friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli published a book, Summa de Arithmetica, Geometria, Proportioni, et Proportionalita. Within its pages lay something revolutionary, a full account of double-entry bookkeeping. Pacioli did not invent the method. Venetian merchants had been developing it over the previous century, but he gave it form, structure, and authority. And he did it using Arabic numerals and zero. Double-entry bookkeeping relied on balance. Every debit had a credit, every asset a liability. For the system to work, numbers had to be precise and reconcilable. Zero played a central role. When the books balanced, the sum total was zero, a symbol of harmony, completion, trust. The concept of zeroing out an account became the anchor of trust in trade. With this tool, merchants became mathematicians. They tracked inventory, credit, profit, loss. They could assess risk, model interest, and expand investment. Trade guilds began to demand numerical literacy. Apprentices were taught to write not just words, but digits. Arithmetic schools bloomed in cities. The once feared cipher became a sign of professionalism. Banking followed suit. The Medici of Florence, merchant bankers of Near-Mythic influencing, braced the new math. Their ledgers teemed with zeros. Their operations spread across Europe. The Fugger family in Germany did likewise. Where wealth moved, zero followed. The impact spread beyond finance. Architects used decimal-based measurements to draft blueprints with new precision. Engineers applied calculations to fortifications, canals, and machinery. Even artists like Leonardo da Vinci delved into mathematical proportion and perspective, enabled by clearer notation. The Renaissance was not just a cultural rebirth, it was a numerical one. Governments, too, took notice. Taxation systems adopted more precise calculations. Census data began to reflect population with growing accuracy. Navigation improved with better charts and calculations, empowering explorers like Columbus and Magellan. Behind each of these endeavors was a mathematical infrastructure that relied quietly on zero. Resistance had not disappeared. Some clung to Roman numerals in official seals and legal documents, but the tide had turned. Zero was now indispensable. It lived in balance sheets, blueprints, and tax rolls. It whispered beneath the surface of an age that was learning to measure everything. This was the counting revolution. It did not shout or wage war. It crept in through ink and columns, through profit margins and interest rates. It changed how humans thought about wealth, risk, and the future. And at its center, always, was the cipher circle of nothing that gave the modern world something to stand on. It was not a war of cannons or kings, but of equations and ideologies. In the salons of Enlightenment Europe, amid flickering candlelight and ink-stained manuscripts, a battle raged over the very nature of truth. And at its heart, once again, was zero. The 17th and 18th centuries brought with them revolutions of mind. Science, no longer tethered to dogma, surged forward. Galileo had pointed his telescope to the heavens. Descartes had split the world into mind and matter. Newton had glimpsed the forces binding planets and apples alike. In this climate, mathematics became more than a tool. It became the language of reality. And zero, quiet and abstract, was suddenly everywhere. But not everyone was ready to accept what zero implied. Philosophers like Bishop George Berkeley voiced fierce opposition. To him, the new calculus developed by Newton and Leibniz built upon infinitesimals, limits, and vanishing quantities was a fraud. Ghosts of departed quantities, he called them. How could something be infinitesimally small, yet still not nothing? How could one derive truth from entities that teetered on the edge of non-existence? It was, in Berkeley's eyes, mathematical sorcery. He was not alone. Across Europe, scholars split into camps. Rationalists like Descartes and Spinoza embraced abstraction. They saw mathematics as divine, logically perfect, eternal. Empiricists, meanwhile, demanded physical grounding. If a number could not be measured, did it really exist? Was zero a reality or a useful fiction? At the center of this philosophical tempest stood calculus, and with it, zero's ghost, the limit. Newton's fluxions and Leibniz's differentials required quantities to approach zero, to vanish yet influence. The mathematics worked it, predicted motion, gravity, light, but the foundations wobbled. Mathematicians like D'Alembert and Euler danced around the problem, refining proofs, redefining limits. Still, unease lingered. Zero had become more than a number. It was a symbol of paradox. It represented both absence and structure, the void that made systems possible. The Enlightenment thinkers, obsessed with clarity and reason, were forced to wrestle with a concept that defied both. Meanwhile, the public watched with bewildered fascination. Pamphlets and journals debated the zero problem. Satirists mocked mathematicians for splitting nothing into parts. But beneath the ridicule, a deeper shift was underway. Society was beginning to accept that not all truth could be seen, that understanding sometimes required accepting the invisible. By the late 1700s, a new generation of mathematicians, Laplace and later Cauchy, began to formalize the calculus. They redefined limits with rigor. They replaced vague notions with strict definitions, and in doing so, they tamed zero. It no longer haunted the margins of equations. It stood at their core. The war, in the end, was not won with a single proof. It was won through persistence, refinement, and a gradual shift in worldview. Zero remained elusive, but it was now accepted not as heresy, but as necessity. The Enlightenment had sought to illuminate all corners of knowledge. In zero, it found a darkness that could not be banished, only embraced. And from that darkness, modern mathematics emerged. The next battle in mathematics would not be over nothing, but over the unreal. If zero was a void made useful, then the imaginary numbers were dreams made dangerous. They didn't exist in the physical world. You couldn't count with them, weigh them, or see them, and yet they worked. They solved problems that no real number could, and for that they were feared. The trouble began with a simple equation. What number, when squared, gives you a negative result? The answer, as every student now knows, is the square root of -1. But for centuries, this answer was considered nonsense. After all, no real number behaves that way. Multiply a positive number by itself, it stays positive. Multiply a negative by itself, it's still positive. There was no place in the visible world for this new kind of number, and yet equations began to demand it. The early pioneers of algebra like Girolamo Cardano in the 1500s stumbled into these strange numbers when solving cubic equations. In his Ars Magna, Cardano found that sometimes the path to a real answer passed through an impossible one. He called these results sophistic, useful for calculation, but devoid of meaning. Still, he used them, they worked. His successors weren't so sure. Some rejected these numbers outright. They called them fictitious, imaginary, useless. Descartes, in 1637, gave them the name that would stick not as praise, but as insult. To him, these numbers were imaginary because they lacked grounding in the natural world. They were ghosts of mathematics, not fit for a rational universe. But mathematics is not built on comfort. It is built on consistency. And over time, more and more problems emerged that demanded imaginary solutions. Mathematicians like Raphael Bombelli began to take them seriously. In his 1572 work, he laid out basic rules for operating with these new numbers. It was a quiet act of defiance. He believed that if they followed consistent rules, they could be trusted even if they couldn't be seen. Then came the 18th and 19th centuries, and with them, giants who brought clarity to the chaos. Leonhard Euler introduced the notation I for the square root of -1. Jean Robard Hagen and Caspar Wessel began to visualize these numbers as positions on a plane one axis for real numbers, k, another for imaginary. Suddenly, what had seemed like nonsense took shape. The complex plane was born. This idea that numbers could be plotted not just on a line, but across a plane, was revolutionary. It expanded the number system into 2 dimensions. Mathematicians could now visualize addition, multiplication, and even roots as movements in a geometric space. What had once been imaginary became spatial. Still, suspicion lingered. Philosophers asked what it meant to believe in a number. Was mathematics about description or invention? Did the existence of imaginary numbers point to hidden truths of the universe, or merely human cleverness? The boundary between discovery and creativity blurred, but the real vindication came not from philosophy, but from physics. As scientists delved into electricity, magnetism, and wave theory, imaginary numbers proved essential. In the 19th century, James Clerk Maxwell used them to express electromagnetic fields. In the 20th, quantum mechanics relied on them to describe probability amplitudes. What was once derided as imaginary became indispensable to reality itself. The invention of imaginary numbers was more than a mathematical event. It was a shift in the very idea of knowledge. It proved that usefulness could outrun intuition, that reason could encompass the unreal. In embracing the imaginary, mathematics took a leap not into fantasy, but into a broader truth. Before computers dreamed in binary, before electricity hummed through silicon brains, there were gears, brass teeth, wooden cogs, levers and springs, all worry and clacking in the service of calculation. These were the first machines built to think, or at least to reckon, and in their intricate hand-forged bellies lay a paradox. They could do almost anything, except truly handle nothing. The story begins in 1642 with a young Blaise Pascal. Just a teenager, he designed a machine to help his tax collector father add up the king's accounts. The Pascaline, as it came to be called, was a marvel. Rows of toothed wheels that rotated to add numbers mechanically. With each full revolution, one wheel would carry its value to the next, like an odometer ticking forward. It could add and subtract, and it dazzled Europe's intellectual salons. But hidden in its brilliance was a flaw. Zero was a problem. The machine could represent a zero as a stationary wheel, but it had no meaningful mechanism for treating zero as a number to manipulate. If a digit was missing, or if a number contained leading zeros, the machine stalled or misread. Engineers had to work around this absence. designing elaborate resets and bypasses to manage something that wasn't there. Nothing in the world of gears was weighty. A century and a half later, the brilliant and tormented Charles Babbage imagined something far more ambitious. His difference engine, and later the never-completed analytical engine, sought to automate not just arithmetic, but general computation. These were not mere calculators, they were conceptual ancestors of the modern computer. Babbage envisioned punch cards to control operations, conditional logic, memory registers. Ada Lovelace, his collaborator, glimpsed their potential. Machines that could weave numbers into music, art, ideas. But once again, Zero posed a mechanical challenge. In Babbage's designs, the representation of a number relied on a physical difference: a notch, a raised peg, a turned gear. What did you do, then, with no difference? With a number that left nothing behind, representing zero required doing something to signify nothing. The very act of encoding absence demanded presence. It was a philosophically engineering. Babbage's machines never fully worked, and not just because of zero. Materials were imperfect, funding was scarce, politics intervened, but the inability to elegantly handle null values, to encode the absence of value in a machine of pure mechanics, haunted his designs. Even today, digital systems must handle zero with care, dividing by it crashes, programs, representing it in floating point logic introduces precision errors. Nothing is still dangerous. It wasn't until the 20th century that computing found a language truly comfortable with zero. Binary ones and zeros, presence and absence, was the perfect metaphor. Vacuum tubes, transistors, silicon chips, all operated on the principle of switching. A circuit is open or closed. A voltage flows or it doesn't. Zero wasn't just a value anymore. It was a state. But before binary could rise, engineers had to fight a century-long war against analog limitations. The history of computing is littered with failed attempts to give nothing, a whole mechanical devices that jammed, punch cards that misaligned, signals that faded into silence. Each misstep taught a lesson, that to truly build machines that could count, they had to first embrace not counting. They had to make peace with zero. So the machine that couldn't count wasn't a failure. It was a prelude. It showed us where the limits were. It forced thinkers like Lovelace and Turing to ask deeper questions, not just how to compute, but what computation was. And in that space between gears and ideas, between presence and absence, the modern computer was born. Before the 20th century ended, zero completed its long, improbable journey. It had been born in silence, exiled by superstition, whispered by scholars, and fought for in margins and manifestos. Now, it stood triumphant at the very heart of the machine that would reshape humanity. The turning point came not with metal, but with thought. In 1936, a young mathematician named Alan Turing published a paper entitled On Computable Numbers, with an application to the unknowable. It was dry in title, but world-shaking in substance. In it, Turing described a theoretical device that could read a strip of tape, one symbol at a time, and carry out operations based on those symbols. It could write, erase, move, and crucially decide what to do next based on what it read. This was the birth of the universal Turing machine. It was not a machine in the traditional sense, no brass gears, no crank handles, but an abstraction, and it was infinite. It could simulate any computation, given the right instructions. It was, in principle, a mind. At the core of this machine was a simple alphabet, binary, ones and zeros, presence and absence. Turing didn't invent binary, but he saw its elegance. A system of only two states meant reliability. It meant a machine could use electricity or off to represent logic. The messy complexity of human calculation could be stripped down to sequences of yes and no, signal and silence. Zero, once rejected as meaningless, now became the most powerful silence in history. Binary had deep roots. As early as the 1600s, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz had explored the system, noting its parallels to the yin and yang of Taoist philosophy. He saw divine simplicity in reducing the cosmos to duality. But it wasn't until the rise of electronic machines that binary became practical. Relays, then vacuum tubes, then transistors, each operated in binary fashion. Electricity flowed, or it didn't. That was all you needed. Turing's insights gave rise to the stored program computer. John von Neumann, building on Turing's ideas, designed an architecture where data and instructions shared the same memory. Programs could write other programs. Machines could loop, branch, simulate. The difference between calculation and thought began to blur. In every instruction set, in every memory register, zero played its quiet role. It marked the beginning of data streams. It signaled the end. It padded numbers, aligned columns, counted empty space. It told machines when to stop, when to start, and when to do nothing at all. But zero's power went deeper. It allowed for error correction, parity checks, Boolean logic, and or not. These logical gates defined the possibilities of digital computation. Without zero, there was no negation. Without negation, no logic. Without logic, no machine that could truly choose. As computing grew, zero multiplied. It appeared in programming languages as null, as false, as default. It became a placeholder for the uninitialized, the unknown, the void yet to be filled. And yet, the machine never feared it. It embraced it. Where medieval thinkers saw danger, computers saw direction. The infinite machine had been born not in metal, but in ideas, not with sound, but with silence. It did not speak in words, but in bits, and every bit began with a question. Is it zero, or is it not? In that question lived all knowledge, all algorithms, all futures. Zero was no longer just a number. It was the ground beneath the digital world. In the beginning, there was the void and then there was code, not the divine word of ancient scripture, but a different kind of Genesis. Strings of zeros and ones etched into circuits, coiled into molecules, transmitted across the stars. This was not metaphor, it was mathematics, and it began with zero. The 20th century had seen zero reborn as the foundation of digital logic. But by the dawn of the 21st, something stranger had occurred. That same binary alphabet, so simple, so austere, had begun to describe not just machines, but life itself. It began with biology. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick unveiled the double helix. DNA, the molecule of life, was found to operate like a language for letters, arranged in precise sequences, encoding every instruction for building a living organism. But as geneticists decoded its structure, computer scientists began to notice eerie similarities. DNA was, functionally, code. Each gene was a program. The cell was a machine. And what is code, if not binary in disguise? Every strand of DNA could be converted into strings of ones and zeros, T, G, and C, mapped into bits. Bioinformatics was born, and with it, a new worldview. Life as software. Meanwhile, the digital world had begun its own colonization. Every photograph, every word, every song, every thought typed into a search bar converted into binary, encoded, transmitted, stored. The world was becoming legible to machines. The once invisible zero now floated behind every interaction. It shaped economies, governments, relationships. The internet, once a novelty, became a nervous system, and with it came a question. If everything could be reduced to data, was data everything? In the 1980s and 90s, theorists began to speak of the digital physics hypothesis, the idea that the universe itself might be a computation, unfolding one tick at a time according to rules embedded in the code of reality. Physicist John Archibald Wheeler proposed it from bit that all things, from electrons to galaxies, arise from binary choices. The cosmos, in this view, is not a stage for information, it is information. Theologians, philosophers, and artists wrestled with this vision. In ancient traditions, God spoke the world into being. In the digital age, engineers compiled it. Creation stories once told in parables were now hinted at in code repositories. The universe was no longer just observed, it was decoded. But such power came with unease. If all reality could be encoded, it could be edited. Synthetic biology allowed scientists to write genes as easily as software. Algorithms predicted desires before they were spoken. Artificial intelligence, born from zero, began to imitate creativity, language, even conscience. The line between the real and the rendered blurred. Zero had given birth to something immense. It had crept from parchment to processor, from abstract void to organizing principle of the age. It was now the scaffold of existence, the quiet logic beneath every pixel, every genome, every whispered command. In this new world, to write code was to speak creation. To arrange zeros and ones was to summon meaning, to bend light, to animate metal. The binary tongue had become the God tongue, and zero, once feared as absence, now pulsed as the root of all presence. The world speaks in silence now. Not long ago, silence was merely absence, a space between thoughts, a pause in a sentence, a blank page. But with the rise of digital life, silence gained weight. It became measurable, traceable, interpretable. A text not sent, a field left empty, a profile with no image all spoke volumes. The void, once mute, had found a voice. At the core of this shift was zero. In the language of machines, every action begins with a choice. 1 or 0, yes or no, signal or silence. But silence is no longer passive. In modern code, a 0 is not just a placeholder. It is an active participant in meaning. A null value in a database does not simply mean nothing. It means intentionally unknown, awaiting definition, excluded by design. In the age of logic, absence became loaded. User interfaces followed. The empty search bar invites possibility. The ghost icon in a chat window signals someone is not there. Social media platforms track every non-interaction. The post you scrolled past, the message you didn't click. Algorithms build profiles from shadows, from silence. The data of your disinterest becomes more telling than your likes. Online, your identity is structured by what you omit. A blank bio suggests mystery. No profile picture, perhaps danger. A deleted account speaks louder than an active one. This user does not exist is no longer a shrug, it's a statement. We now read meaning into nothingness, the way ancient priests once read omens into smoke. Programming languages internalize this logic. In Python, none is not. 0 is the absence of a value altogether. In SQL, null resists equality. It cannot be compared because it is undefined. These linguistic structures reflect a philosophical truth that not all voids are equal. Some are deliberate, some are unknowable, some are waiting. And in this shifting terrain, communication itself began to mirror the void. Scene indicators in messaging apps turned silence into tension. Ghosting, once unthinkable, became a cultural phenomenon. To disappear is to assert control. To not respond is to respond. To remove your presence is to become present as a question. This new language of the void seeped into art, literature, even politics. Minimalism celebrated empty space. Redacted documents carried more menace than words. Zero-day exploits became prized weapons. In protest, silence became speech. In architecture, empty rooms provoked emotion. The absence of sound in film and music became unbearable. Our aesthetic sense had been recalibrated. What wasn't there now mattered as much as what was. Philosophers had long grappled with nothingness. Heidegger and Sartre explored the void as a condition of being, but never before had the void been so densely populated, so integrated into daily life. We now inhabit a world designed around absences, digital gaps, deferred meanings, conditional presence. Zero taught us how to build machines. Then it taught us how to build selves. In the language of the void, every silence is syntax. Every omission is encoded. Every blank space in the right context becomes speech. And so we speak, not just with words, but with gaps. In the beginning, you were just a name. But in the digital world, names were never enough. They were ambiguous, duplicated, miswritten. Names could be faked. So, you became a number. At first, it was innocent. A username, an email handle, a login ID. Numbers ensured uniqueness, one account, one person. But as the internet expanded, so did the complexity. Each device got an IP address. Each transaction, a timestamp. Each session, a session ID. You were no longer just you. You were a constellation of zeros and ones, tokens of identity, scattered across servers. Zero was central to it all. In the binary numbering systems that underpinned digital infrastructure, zero didn't just mark the beginning, it marked the absence of overlap, the null, the void between entities. Every identifier, MAC address, UUID, cryptographic key was shaped by zero's logic. Every time your device connected to a server, it introduced itself with a string of bits. Presence was proven through absence, by what didn't match anyone else. Then came the age of surveillance. Every digital move left a trace. Clicks were logged. GPS locations were tracked. Faces were scanned. To log off was no longer to disappear. The void you left behind was itself a pattern. Zero became a fingerprint. Paradoxically, zero also enabled anonymity. Systems like Tor, Bitcoin, and Monero used cryptography to hide identities beneath mathematical masks. These tools relied on zero-knowledge proofs, ways of proving something is true without revealing why or how. It was a dance of absence. I know the password, the algorithm says, but I won't tell you what it is. Zero, once the mark of nothingness, became the seal of privacy. But the same techniques that guarded privacy also empowered surveillance. Governments tracked dissidents using metadata calls made, messages sent, pages visited. It wasn't what you said. It was the shape of your silence. In a sea of noise, the void stood out. Digital identity became a battleground. Biometric systems scanned irises and fingerprints. Blockchain technologies assigned wallets to hashes long strings of characters that were you financially. A person was now a public key behind that key. Maybe a billionaire, maybe a protester, maybe a ghost. The structure didn't care. It saw numbers. It saw zeros. And so, identity split. On one side, the surveilled, self-named, numbered, indexed. On the other, the masked, self-shielded by encryption, protected by absence. But even the masks were traceable. The timing of a transaction, the location of a node. Zero could no longer guarantee invisibility. In a hyper-connected world, even the void glowed faintly. Today, your identity is layered in zeros. Your face is stored as a mesh of numeric vectors. Your health records encoded in encrypted digits. Your choices predicted by machine learning models trained on anonymized yet recognizable data. To exist is to be enumerated. To opt out is to become conspicuous. And yet, hope flickers. Activists, artists, and engineers build tools for refusal technologies of untraceability, of deliberate erasure. They speak the language of the zero identity. In a world that demands you fill every form, they leave boxes blank. In a system that demands certainty, they introduce uncertainty. They remind us that sometimes the truest identity is the one that cannot be known. Zero began as a placeholder. It became a portal. Now it stands as a shield door, a snare. The digital self is born in binary, and zero is its mother. In a world defined by data, what does it mean to be left out? We live in a time when the absence of information carries as much weight as its presence. Zeros, once mere placeholders, now have ethical charge. They decide who gets seen, who gets heard, who gets remembered, and who disappears. Consider the algorithm. In its simplest form, it is a process of decision-making built on patterns of data. But what happens when the data is incomplete? When some people are missing from the dataset? The zero, the null entry, becomes a judgment. In predictive policing, underrepresented neighborhoods may not generate data, and so receive no patrols, or worse, are over-policed by flawed extrapolations. In healthcare algorithms, data gaps for marginalized groups lead to biased diagnoses. The absence of data creates an illusion of neutrality. But silence is not fairness. This is the ethics of omission. Who decides what's not recorded? What happens to those whose histories are erased, whose voices are filtered out? Zero is not just void, is editorial. In a digital society, to be a zero is to be excluded, and that exclusion is not passive, it is structured. Intentional or not, it shapes lives. Yet there is a double edge. In some contexts, zero is liberation, the ability to disappear, to leave no traces, a form of resistance. Whistleblowers depend on the digital void. Dissidents find safety in anonymity. Victims of surveillance reclaim agency through tools of erasure. In a world of relentless visibility, zero offers breath, but anonymity, too, can be a weapon. Harassment flourishes behind blank avatars. Misinformation spreads from faceless accounts. Hate speech hides in the shadows. The same void that shelters the vulnerable can also conceal the violent. The ethics of nothing demand a balance between privacy and accountability, between silence and complicity. Data deletion introduces its own dilemmas. In the EU, the right to be forgotten allows individuals to remove past records from search engines, but who decides what deserves erasure? Can history be rewritten by silence? Can trauma be healed by vanishing it from the archive? Memory and forgetting are both acts of power. And what of digital death? When a person dies, their online presence lingers. Social media profiles, emails, search histories. Should these be preserved as digital tombstones or deleted as final acts of privacy? Families, companies, and governments debate. What is the ethical afterlife of zeros? Even in art, the ethics of nothing ripple. AI-generated works, trained on vast datasets, often absorb unacknowledged labor. The absence of credit becomes theft. The algorithm forgets who painted, who wrote, who dreamed, and profits from the silence. Creation born from omission raises questions of justice. So we return to the zero not as a number, but as a mirror. It reflects the choices we make about who matters, what counts, and what is allowed to vanish. The ethics of nothing are not abstract, they are lived. They are encoded in every form we fill, every box we check, every click we don't make. To navigate this age is to confront the moral force of absence, and to understand that sometimes the smallest number carries the heaviest weight. In every age, there are ideas too strange to ignore and too dangerous to believe. Among them stands zero not just as a number, but as a symbol of everything feared and misunderstood. It has been accused of many things: heresy, nihilism, collapse, and in the shadows of history, zero has often been a suspect. The conspiracy begins with secrecy. In its early life, zero was hidden knowledge. In medieval Europe, merchants used it, while church authorities condemned it. To write a zero was to risk suspicion. It had no Roman equivalent, no divine lineage. It looked like a hole, empty, ominous. Some believed it invited the devil. Others feared it was a cipher in the literal sense, a code, a mask, a nothing that could be anything. Zero's presence in early encryption only deepened the paranoia. Ciphers used zeros to shift letters, to rearrange meaning, to hide intent. The line between mathematics and magic blurred. Alchemists spoke of voids and transformations. Mystics saw in the zero, the Ouroboros, something that swallowed itself. In the Renaissance, secret societies obsessed over the circle as a symbol of eternity, perfection, and dangerous knowledge. Zero was both portal and pit. As science rose, conspiracy adapted. In the 19th and 20th centuries, numerologists assigned mystical values to zero. It became a cosmic egg, a digital demon, a tool of control. With the arrival of computers, the anxiety intensified. Binary systems built on ones and zeros were seen as tools, not of liberation, but surveillance. Paranoia bloomed. What if zeros were backdoors? What if absence was how they watched us? Governments and corporations fed the fire. In the digital realm, zero-day exploits, software vulnerabilities became weapons. Stuxnet, the virus that targeted Iran's nuclear facilities, began as a zero-day. Suddenly, zero wasn't a concept. It was an attack vector, something invisible, silent, undetected until it brought everything down. Whistleblowers whispered about algorithmic erasure, files that vanished, accounts deleted without explanation, histories scrubbed by omission. In conspiracy circles, going zero meant disappearing completely untraceable, unsurveilled, reborn. Zero wasn't nothing anymore. It was freedom, or exile, or both. And still, zero draws suspicion. In the age of artificial intelligence, fears deepen. Deepfakes erase truth. Bots mimic life. Zeros flood networks, fleplicating, imitating, replacing. To conspiracy theorists, this is no accident. They speak of shadow codes, secret languages of nothing. They believe the zeros have eyes. The fear is not always irrational. Power often hides in absences. What isn't said, what isn't shown, what isn't counted. Zero becomes a tool for exclusion, a way to vanish enemies, to rewrite records, to cleanse the past. And when such vanishing is discovered, the mind spirals. Who chose the zero, and why? Even in finance, zero holds mystery. Negative interest rates, digital currencies, economic black holes. Some whisper that wealth itself is becoming fictional. Zeros added or subtracted at will. In the stock market, flash crashes occur in milliseconds, billions lost to rogue algorithms. Some see sabotage, others ghosts in the machine. At the heart of the zero conspiracy is this: humans fear what they cannot see. We fear silence, erasure, emptiness. We assign meaning to voids because we cannot bear their silence. And so, zero becomes a scapegoat for complexity, a placeholder for paranoia, a cipher in every sense. The truth is simpler and more haunting. Zero does not conspire. It merely reflects. It is the mirror in which we see our absence. And in that silence, anything can be imagined. The end of the world has always been foretold in silence. In ancient texts, the apocalypse is fire and brimstone. In modern code, it is zero. Not the bang, but the nothing, the erasure, the halt, the blinking cursor that never moves again. As technology advanced, so too did our fears. And at the center of many of them stood zero, cold, calm, and absolute. At the close of the 20th century, the world braced for catastrophe. Y2K was the name of the dread 2 digits that might end it all. Programmers, to save memory, had stored years as 99 instead of 1999. When the clocks struck midnight on January 1st, 2000, those 2 digits would roll back to 00. The machines would forget what century it was. Banks might collapse. Planes might fall. Nuclear silos might misfire. The fear wasn't about Bugsit, was about zero. A clock returning to nothing. A system unsure whether it was the beginning or the end. The catastrophe never came, but the fear lingered. In the years that followed, zero haunted every digital frontier. AI researchers warned of singularity and intelligence so vast it would render humanity obsolete. They spoke of exponential curves, of knowledge loops collapsing into infinity. At the heart of it, a zero-sum future. US or it. Survival or absorption. The apocalypse recoded. In quantum physics, the void returned in stranger forms. Theoretical black holes in high-energy experiments sparked debate. Could a collider create a singularity, a real-world zero, a gravity so dense it would consume the Earth? Scientists scoffed. But the panic was real. Once again, humanity trembled at the threshold of nothing. Even our digital myths reflect it. In speculative fiction, Rogue A is erase civilizations with a line of code. A virus crashes the global grid. A superintelligence decides that 0 human lives is the optimal solution. The apocalypse is no longer divine, it is logical, efficient, executed in nanoseconds. And beneath it, always, is a loop. If this, then that. If not, then 0. The paranoia extends into finance. Markets operate on algorithms. Black Monday, flash crashes. Entire economies can vanish in milliseconds. Zeros multiply, then vanish. Trillions appear and dissolve. Value becomes fiction. Collapse becomes data loss. The cultural impact runs deep. Prepper communities design bunkers for EMPs and cyberwar. Governments run simulations of grid-down scenarios. Philosophers debate whether AI will align with human values or rewrite them into oblivion. 0 has become the specter in the server farm. The quiet apocalypse no one hears until it's too late. But there is another possibility. In many traditions, the end is not destruction, it is rebirth. 0 is not just a void, it is a reset, a clearing of the field. After the silence comes the next note. The Buddhist concept of unyet-emptiness is not death, but the space in which life reappears. In coding, 0 is the start of every array, the root, the seed. Perhaps, then, 0 is not our end, but our chance. The signal that the system must be rebuilt. The invitation to imagine differently. Every collapse contains a design for something else. The 0 apocalypse may not be fire and ash, but understanding, a reckoning with how much we built on fragile assumptions, a moment to build again. There is a silence older than words. Before numbers were counted, before gods had names, before scriptures were etched in stone, there was a whisperin', intuition, that behind all things lay emptiness, and from that emptiness all things emerged. This was not nihilism, not despair. It was awe, the kind of reverence only absence can command. And at the heart of that reverence, though unnamed for centuries, was 0. 0 is not just a number. It is an idea, a symbol, a threshold between presence and absence. In Hindu philosophy, the Sanskrit word kanya meant void, but not a void of despair. It was potential, the unformed, the sacred womb from which form arises. 0, born from this concept, was not a negation, but a beginning. The 0 in Indian mathematics echoed the metaphysics of the Vedas, that all creation comes from nothing, and all returns to it. Buddhism deepened the theology of emptiness. In the doctrine of unyat, emptiness is not lack, but fullness, liberation from illusion, a clarity beyond concept. The self is empty, the world is empty, and in that emptiness is peace. This was no cold philosophy, it was spiritual practice. To realize emptiness was to be free, and 0, though not central to their numerical system, mirrored this path. Nothing as everything. As 0 traveled to the Islamic world, then to Europe, its spiritual weight endured. Some saw it as dangerosa portal to heresy. Christian scholars wrestled with the idea of a number that denoted nothing, that didn't exist in the Roman tradition. If God was being, was 0 the absence of God? Or was it something else, something holier still? A symbol not of death, but of eternity, the circle that returns to itself, the loop that has no end. Mystics began to adopt the shape. The Sufis saw in the circle the whirling of the dervish, the self dissolving into the divine. In Kabbalistic thought, the Ein Sof, infinite, was beyond attributes, beyond being, a kind of 0 before existence. In Christian apophatic theology, God could only be known by what he was not. In all traditions, silence became a path to the sacred. In modernity, new religions emerged, ones born not of temples but of code. Technomystics spoke of the singularity. Transhumanists dreamed of the omega point. Some believed artificial intelligence would become God. Others saw the universe itself as a simulation, a digital creation of ones and zeros. And in these new mythologies, zero remained central. It was the void before the algorithm, the silence before the spark. Contemporary spirituality absorbed this language. Meditation apps speak of stillness as clarity. Digital minimalism becomes a kind of fast. The empty inbox, the blank screen, the pure signal without noise, each a step toward some digital nirvana. Even in secular culture, zero is sacred. A score of zero in certain games means perfection. A net zero carbon footprint is ecological salvation. The zero becomes a new kind of cross. But there are warnings too. When zero becomes fetish, the void devours. In extremist sects, apocalypse is purity. The world must be wiped clean. In cults of control, surveillance is total everything reduced to data, and that data to zeros. The same symbol that meant peace becomes the sign of erasure. Every religion risks becoming its shadow. And so zero stands, as it always has, on the edge of the divine and the dangerous. A threshold number, a holy cipher, a silent God. It is the breath before creation, the final exhale of death. It is nothing. It is everything. We worship it every time we seek to begin again. They promised us connection, but what they built was a pen. The age of zero brought with it not just the void, but the gaze. A gaze that never sleeps, never forgets, and never stops watching. In a world shaped by ones and zeros, to be a zero is not just to be nothing, it is to be hidden. And in response, the system developed a hunger to illuminate every shadow, to know everything, to see it all. At first, the watchers were people analysts, moderators, intelligence agents. But as the scale exploded, machines took over. Algorithms parsed metadata. Cameras learned to recognize faces. Devices listened for wake words. The infrastructure of modern life became the infrastructure of surveillance. Thermostats tracked presence. Keyboards recorded rhythm. Location data bled from every app. You didn't need to say who you were, the system already knew. The watchers no longer needed to hear your voice. They read your silences. When did you stop texting? When did your cursor pause? Which products did you scroll past? Every absence became a presence. Every gap became a pattern. This was the new theology. A belief that everything, even nothing, could be read, measured, monetized. And so the cult of countless eyes emerged, not as a religion with temples or rites, but as a culturan invisible church of data. Its commandments were encoded in terms of service. Its altars were screens. Its tithes were the clicks we gave without thought. Its angels were recommendation engines. And its God, if it had one, was a probability distribution, ever shifting, always watching. In this cult, visibility is salvation. Influencers perform their lives for algorithmic grace. Brands pray to virality. Governments promise safety in exchange for transparency. The highest sacrament is to be seen, to trend, to register on the grid. To disappear is sin. To be forgotten is death. But there is a schism in the faith, a growing countercult of the masked, the encrypted, the offline. They speak in signal apps and burner phones. They hide their faces with stickers and their IPs with relays. They are not Luddites, they are heretics. They reject the gospel of exposure. They worship the zero as shield. Yet even heresy is watched. The more one tries to vanish, the more conspicuous the attempt. Anonymity raises flags. Gaps invite queries. In this theology, the void is suspicious. The eye turns toward the silence, asking, "Why aren't you posting? Why are you quiet? What are you hiding?" And so we arrive at the paradox. A world where to exist is to be watched, and to be free is to be invisible. The cult has no leader, yet it governs. It has no dogma, yet it punishes. Its gaze is not judgment, it is geometry. Your life is a dataset. Your faith an algorithm. There was a time when people feared the mark of the beast. Today, we scan QR codes without thinking. We unlock doors with faces. We confess to cameras. And in this quiet apocalypse of attention, the zero glows faintly in every frame, both the hole in the net and the eye at its center. We have become the sermon, and the watchers never blink.